We're going to get started here. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank our host here at the Harbor City Public Library. Thank you so much for opening your doors. This is kicking off a series of joint Public Works and Budget and Finance Committee hearings on an issue that we all see that's visible, our failed sidewalks. This is we're doing everything we can to correct a failed policy that occurred 40 years ago when the city of Los Angeles passed an ordinance that changed the municipal code by one sentence. And that was, that made the city responsible for repairing all sidewalks damaged by roots of street trees. And the city council then took on the responsibility of fixing sidewalks damaged by street trees, and 2 years later, an overwhelming number of trees, and there was a huge backlog that we're here today to finally correct that policy issue. Last August, the Budget and Finance Committee and the Public Works Committee requested our CAO report to the two committees with recommendations for a comprehensive and sustainable sidewalk repair program. And you'll hear that report today from the CAO's office. No action will be taken today. This is just report. We made a commitment, Mr. Krikorian and I, to get to all parts of the city, all corners of the city, to hear feedback from residents, businesses, stakeholders, neighborhood council members, which I see here, a number represented here today. We are committed to working alongside our colleagues to create a policy that's transparent and efficient and user-friendly. And our goal is, again, to have an opportunity for you, the public, to weigh in on this comprehensive sidewalk repair program. Before we turn it over to the CAO's office for a report, I want to ask my colleague from Council District 2, Mr. Krikorian and Chairman of the Budget and Finance Committee, we welcome you to CD 15. And thank you for joining us, and want to turn it over to you for some opening remarks.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. And first of all, thank you for hosting us here in CD 15. It's a pleasure to be with you, working with you here in your district. But I also want to thank you for the leadership that you've shown on this issue, which is central to the quality of life to every community in our city. This is a city that has 10,000 miles of sidewalks, more sidewalks than any other city in the United States of America. And many of those sidewalks, a great deal of those sidewalks, were built in the years shortly after World War II and shortly before the war, when the city was expanding horizontally at such a rapid rate, the most rapid expansion of any city in the 20th century. Right. And as all of those suburbs were built, and as we expanded outward, lots of concrete was being laid, but much of it is at the end of its useful life now. So we're faced with the task of making up for the maintenance that that's been deferred throughout all that time. And as you pointed out, the tree root problem that we've faced, a lot of those trees were, a few inches around when those sidewalks were laid, and now they're huge mature trees that have caused a great deal of damage. So I'm very proud to be able to work with you on this. As you pointed out, the Budget and Finance Committee that I chair has set aside $50 million over the last 3 years for sidewalks. $50 million when for decades we had essentially spent nothing on sidewalks. So we're at a turning point right now, and through the work that Mr. Buscaino as Chair of Public Works and I as Chair of Budget and Finance have done together, we've introduced 3 motions together to try to develop comprehensive, sustainable, sensible, cost-effective policies that will allow this city not only to ensure that every sidewalk in the city is in good repair, but to establish a foundation for the future so that we never get into a situation like we're in now, where we have so much making up to do. It's been a pleasure to work with you on this so far, Mr. Buscaino, but I have to say, we certainly can't do this. We can't have that kind of a policy. We can't develop that kind of a policy without really thorough input from the public. And that's why we've scheduled 5 meetings like this in every corner of the city. We're starting here in CD15. We'll also be having meetings like this on the west side, on the east side, in South LA, and in the San Fernando Valley. And the end result of all that will hopefully be very thorough discussion with the public of every possible aspect of this policy, which we'll then bring back to City Hall and formulate into the form of a policy that will last for generations to come. So I thank you for that. I look forward to hearing not only the CAO's report, but what the public here has to say as well.
Thank you, Paul. So with that, representing Mr. Miguel Santana's office and the Chief Administrative Office, Patty Huber, who's going to make a presentation. She's also joined by David Hirano and Matthias Farfan from the Chief Legislative Analyst's Office. Stacy's here as well. And then what we'll do once we, after the report, please, Marco, do we have speaker cards? Yes, sir. Back of the room. If those who want to address the committee, please be sure to fill out a speaker card, and we'll call your name after the report from the CAO's office. So with that, I'll turn it over to Patty for her report.
Good evening. Patty Huber with the CAO's office. As you indicated, you requested us to put together a report to create a sustainable sidewalk repair plan and policy for you. The basic goals that we were trying to achieve as we put this report in front of you was that it would be a permanent and ongoing program that was consistent with our recently entered into settlement agreement for the Willits lawsuit, that ensures accessibility for our residents and then shares responsibility for the ongoing sidewalk maintenance and repair with the adjacent property owner. Very broadly, the summary or policy summary is twofold. The residential properties, the city would take responsibility to fix a damaged sidewalk and then return responsibility back to the adjacent property owner. For commercial property owners, we would put in, basically give them a notice with a 1-year moratorium. And after 1 year, then the city would begin to issue notices of repair with the expectation that commercial property owners would pay for those repairs, consistent with both state and city policies. In both cases, the city will issue a no-fee A permit for the work, and that the primary point of entry for the request would be our city's 311 system. As you both indicated, responsibility for the sidewalk has long resided with the property owner. That is what the state law says. In the 70s, the city made a small exception for tree root damage. We did so on the basis of federal funds that were awarded to the city, and then after a year or two dried up, and we never changed our law. And concurrently, then we began to not really effectively enforce our policies and the state laws and our own administrative code, and it created some confusion. The tree root exception that we adopted and that still exists on our books in the admin code is that an adjacent property owner is responsible for the repair of their sidewalks except when the damage is caused by street tree root growth. That's the only exception. So if a residential property had a damaged sidewalk and no tree, they're actually have been and continue to be to this day responsible for that. We've just not enforced it. And that's a large part of why we're in the situation that we are and why we got sued and had to deal with the lawsuit. Under the Willett Settlement Agreement, we have to ensure, consistent with the American with Disabilities Act, that our sidewalks are accessible to the disability community. It requires us to spend $31 million a year over 30 years, with adjustments for inflation every 5 years. So for an approximate total of $1.4 billion over the 30-year period. The goal is to be accountable and transparent to the public and the plaintiffs, responsive to requests from the public, and to prioritize pathways of greatest use in our high transit areas, in and around places where people need to get the most, as well as to address the worst of the worst situations. And to provide a very cost-effective stewardship, of our public funds. The city does have a wide variety of options for achieving compliance. You know, we could just do straight out notice and inspection and not do anything other than require everybody to fix their sidewalks in compliance with the law. We could put in a point of sale or point of permit plan, point of service. We could look at a cost-sharing model with some proportionate share between the city and property owners. The city could do all of it, although we couldn't afford it, I will say, or the fix and release, which we are proposing. In most other cities in the state, the majority of them share the financial responsibility. Again, the state law is very clear on that, and that's really what most cities do. Our overall recommendations from the report are to reestablish a sidewalk repair program that is consistent with our settlement on the Willits lawsuit, to designate the Board of Public Works to oversee that program and the city engineer to be the program manager, to return responsibility for sidewalk repair to adjacent property owners, including even if it is with tree root damage, through a phased-in program, which is what we're calling fix and release, to develop a tracking system for any requests, appoint an ADA coordinator for pedestrian rights-of-way, implement a sidewalk asset management system, and provide assistance to property owners who are initiating repairs on their own by creating a pre-qualified contractor list for sidewalk repair, as well as the waiving of the permit fees, which is something that we have already done. Mm-hmm. And then to create a plan for urban forestry so that we ensure street trees remain healthy and vibrant, as they are an essential component of our city infrastructure, so we don't want to eliminate those. We believe that this is a reasonable approach to move forward. Our status quo does not work. We don't have, we have limited resources in the city. There is a lot of confusion over responsibility, and it is what has led us to the situation that we're in, so we can't continue with what we're doing. We need to put in a thoughtful, sustainable, ongoing program so that 30 years from now, we're not being sued again because our sidewalks are back in the condition that they are today. This needs to really be a program that outlasts our requirements under the settlement agreement, ensures accessibility and accessible pathways for our disability community. All sidewalk repair requirements that we have in the city were not created by tree roots, and those have always been the responsibility of the adjacent property owner. And we're now creating a system that provides that clarity to the on a go-forward basis. I think that summarizes the general recommendations and policy, and I and Stacy are here for any questions that you might have.
Thank you. Why, some questions that we're getting from social media networks, and I'd like to welcome our Periscope audience as well, watching live. We're live, Mr. Kokorian, by the way, on Periscope. Did you know that? Oh, Periscope, okay. Why are we treating residential and commercial property different? Because that's one concern that we're getting from our business community.
First and foremost, everybody has that fundamental responsibility, commercial or residential.
Mm-hmm.
They are responsible for the sidewalks adjacent to their facility. In developing this proposal, one thing that we took into consideration is that for many residential property owners, there are fewer financial opportunities possibly or options for them to finance the repairs that would more likely be available to commercial property owners and operators of multifamily residences. And so we tried to keep that in mind as we put this program together. And ultimately, we are still saying the residential property owner is ultimately responsible. They'll get one fix from the city if their sidewalk is damaged at the point that we inspect it. We'll fix it, and then it's theirs. And if it needs a repair at some point in the future, they're going to be responsible for it. It's not a perpetual, we're always going to fix residential property owners. And the other issue is, while $1.4 billion sounds like a lot of money, it really, we don't believe would be enough to fix all of the sidewalks in the city. And the commercial corridors, those are wider, longer, and would tend to be more costly repairs as well.
And just those in the audience, one report that we asked back was to do a side-by-side analysis on using private contractors versus using a city crews. It's important to know if we can, obviously we want to maximize and get our bang for the buck in the $31 million that we're on the hook for. Can you share with us the implementation or the status of the implementation strategies as it relates to point of sale, point of permit, point of service?
I'm going to let Stacy take that question.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
As far as the implementation strategies on some of these other options that we have before us, point of sale, point of permit, point of service.
So those are different strategies that are available to the city. Something to point out, I think, with regards to those strategies is that implementation may not result in contiguous pathways of sidewalks, and so those would be strategies that the city could consider further along once we've sort of remedied the backlog.
It's kind of a hybrid approach.
Mm-hmm.
I see. Okay. And I know most of us are asking, how soon can we begin the program?
So we've already begun the program with regards to sidewalks.
Sidewalks in front of city-owned properties, right?
Exactly.
And that was what Mr. Krikorian alluded to as far as the $50 million that we've dedicated, right?
Correct.
Okay. Mr. Krikorian?
Yeah, actually, just to put this into a little bit more of a context. So there is $50 million that's been budgeted in the last 3 budget years that's now in a sidewalk trust fund. CIEP, but it will be moving into the sidewalk trust fund. All of that money will be spent on sidewalk repairs. The policy that is in place now concentrates that money on the properties that the public needs the most. Sidewalks adjacent to public properties, like this library. By the way, I checked the sidewalks. They look
Clear.
excellent,
That's
Mr.
right.
Buscaina. So congratulations. The sidewalks out front are beautiful. But they aren't in front of every library.
Right.
And they aren't in front of every police station or fire station or park. And we're focusing first on making sure that the public's sidewalks are fixed first. So that money, and correct me if I'm wrong, but we could easily spend the entirety of that $50 million strictly on repairing sidewalks adjacent to public properties.
Yes,
I think
we
there's
believe so.
sufficient demand to at least spend that much. So the policy that we're discussing today is, first of all, it's a proposal that the CAO has made as a framework for our discussion. This is not a policy that Mr. Buscaino or that I or that our respective committees have adopted as our own yet, but it is a touchstone for further discussion by these committees. And I think that the one point I'd like to make going forward is we have reached a settlement in this Willits lawsuit. The importance of that is that the city is committing $30 million per year for 30 years with adjustments upward for inflation. There's only 3 ways that that money can be spent. It can be spent directly on fixing sidewalks. It can be spent on enforcing the property owner's obligation to fix sidewalks, or some combination of those things through a cost-sharing thing. That's the only 3 ways that that money can be spent. 86% of the cities that we've looked at in the United States impose some obligation on the property owner. It's only 14% of the cities take that burden on entirely on behalf of the city. And that makes sense because what we're talking about really is a cost allocation that creates the greatest cost efficiency. One way or the other, the only money that is going to be spent is the taxpayers' money. It's either the taxpayers' money that they've already paid into the city's budget as part of their taxes, or it's money that they're going to be spending directly because they have a broken sidewalk in front of their house. One way or the other, the burden of this cost can only fall on all of us, the people. And so our task is to figure out what's the best way to do that in the most cost-effective way and fairest way for everyone. It's not choosing between the people and the city. There is no such juxtaposition as that. The city is the people. The money that the city has to spend is the people's money. And so our task is to make sure that we do that in the most cost-effective and sustainable way.
And that is what we were attempting to create that balance with as we were putting forward a recommended policy, was how to balance all those competing needs while meeting the very critical requirement of accessibility, which is, we're required by law to have accessible pathways, and we have not done our job there.
As far as even identifying it, as Mr. Krikorian alluded to earlier, 40% of our sidewalks, nearly half are in failed condition or are crumbling. And the report indicated using a GIS system. Can you elaborate on that as far as knowing where these sidewalks lie in the city of Los Angeles? I know, and finding a better way to identify using technology, neighborhood councils, to identify these cracked, failed sidewalks. And I know even through litigation, we've paid out a number of claims on trip and falls. Can you elaborate that, please?
I'll do my best, and Stacy will fill in where I get it wrong. We truthfully today don't know where all of our failed sidewalks are beyond things that have been reported directly to the Bureau of Street Services or through our 311 system. But we do not today have a comprehensive sidewalk inventory, so to speak. And one of the discussion points in the settlement was doing like a block by block survey, which was going to take years to accomplish, and so on. And so we came to an agreement where we weren't going to do that survey up front before we began doing any repairs, but that the city did need to get into a better sort of asset management kind of situation. So we are going to put in a GIS-based database system that will allow us to track where repairs are being done. We'll keep track of part of this program will be to do the enforcement component, which is the going out, doing an inspection, notifying of repairs, or certifying that the sidewalk is okay. I mean, we do have places in the city where the sidewalk is okay and doesn't need to be repaired. It would be certified as not needing repair and turned over to the adjacent property owner for future ownership and responsibility. We would start to build the inventory as we were doing that. As we got the calls into 311, we would start to geocode and put those into the database start addressing the worst of the worst, and slowly over the course of the 30 years, we would end up with, sometime during that time, essentially an inventory of all of the sidewalks and a status on where they are and what repairs were done. It would also allow people to be able to see what repairs had been done. It will be important to our reporting that we're required to do under the settlement agreement of what have we accomplished, where have we done repairs, have we spent our $31 million, all of those questions that we'll have to answer regularly, and allow the public to see when repairs that they've requested are being scheduled and when they've been completed.
Thanks, Patty.
I didn't know if I missed something.
Actually, if I could just ask one budget-related question, because you did say that the CAO does not anticipate that the amount set aside for the Willett settlement would be enough to repair every sidewalk. And I guess, given the fact that we don't have a comprehensive sidewalk survey, upon what is that based?
It's really based upon the assessment of our professionals from street services and Bureau of Engineering, that based on what we do know, we don't believe, it's not a scientific, hard, we've crunched every single number, because we just don't have the data to do that. But it does not appear that based on the cost of sidewalk repairs and what we know of how many miles of sidewalks we have, that we would conceivably be able to repair all of them with the available funds.
So I'm going to make an observation that suggests a little bit more reason for optimism, and I'd like to be optimistic to think that we will be able to do this. There's been kind of a figure that's been bandied about for quite some time now that has been taken as a matter of faith, that 40% of our sidewalks in Los Angeles are broken. That is flatly false. And I think anyone who walks anywhere in Los Angeles would see that that is not true. Where I think that number came from is a survey that Street Services did about 7 or 8 years ago, in which they did a spot check of a number of parcels and found that 38% of the parcels had some degree of damage. That's a very different proposition than saying 40% of the linear feet of the sidewalks are broken. In fact, if you break that down, it's around, if you look at the degree of damage suggested by that survey, it would break down to about 12% of the linear feet of the sidewalk system would have damage that needs to be replaced. And that's a much smaller number to work with than 40%, obviously. It's still going to be very expensive, but I think if we can do some of the things that we've talked about for cost reduction, utilizing contractors for this, using apprenticeship, using alternative materials and alternative construction designs that maybe aren't quite as expensive as 4-inch thick slab with rebar and so on. I believe that there's ways that we can bring costs down and shoot at a lower target number in the first place. And I am confident that with this commitment, this continuing commitment, we will fix every sidewalk in the city within that period of time, within those 30 years. So it's our task to make sure that we can do that.
Okay, thank you so much. Michael, any cards, any speaker cards on this item?
No, Mr. Chair.
Anyone here, please come forward and give them to Sergeant. Thank you. Any other cards? Please be sure, if you'd like to speak, fill out a speaker card. Mr. Baeza, thank you so much. Okay, come forward, please. And Angela Bland, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us.
I'm a resident in San Pedro.
Put the microphone down so we can hear you.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
And thank you for a lot of clarity as a resident, that I was unsure of how the money that was allocated would be for residential versus commercial. I got that. However, I am still not sure going forward the 30 million you talk about, how's that, if the public works sidewalks are the priority, how would that money be allocated to the residential folks? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Because you're saying 50 million right now is not gonna even touch the residents because the priority are libraries, city hall, so on.
You can respond to that.
So as we were looking at.
Normally, we don't do cute back and forth, but this is a
Right,
special
yeah.
meeting. We'll consider it.
Oh, sorry.
Think it's
No,
okay?
no, no.
Do
it's
I
okay.
only get
Go
one
ahead.
question? Because I have a follow-up as well.
Well, let me start with that one since it's in my mind. We started with the sidewalks around city facilities because we are the owners of those properties, and therefore the responsibility for those sidewalks is clearly ours. And we need to create and ensure that they are accessible. We're the property owners as an entity, so we started there as we began looking at needing to comply with the ADA requirements and the settlement that we were addressing. So that work was beginning to happen. Most of those are facilities that the public comes to regularly, routinely, like libraries, city hall, parks. And so we needed to make sure that we had created the accessible pathways there, because that's one of the priority areas, is places that people want and need to go to routinely. And it allowed us to get started as to allow time for council to come up with the policy on how are we going to address this on the go-forward basis, yet start to make inroads into the work that needed to be done. And then the 30 million, some of that money will be spent for the inspection and notification enforcement component. The people who need to go out and inspect the sidewalk and make a determination, does it need to be fixed? Or is it okay? If it needs to be fixed and it's next to a residential property, then a portion of that money would be spent to do the fix. If it doesn't need to be fixed, then we'll certify it and we'll move on and continue going throughout the city, doing those inspections and notifications. Again, if it's in the commercial area, we're going to kind of give them a heads up, this is coming, and then a year from now, we'll start going out and doing the notifications, and then we are hopeful that in that time frame, at least in the proposal that the CAO has put forward, I don't yet know what council will adopt, that they might voluntarily begin to do that work on their own, knowing that the enforcement is going to come. So the funds part of the 30 million we're spending is on that sort of enforcement notification piece, and then a portion of it would be for the actual repairs.
Okay, so bottom line, the 30 million yearly that would be allocated will go towards some type of process, resource for the resident, and not just continuously for public works buildings.
Correct.
Okay. Follow-up question. I thank you for having a meeting like this. I really appreciate it as a resident. I know this is just to develop a policy. After you make all your stops and the four corners, as you called it, what is the process you're going to follow to adapt the policy? And are you looking, as he touched on, non-traditional ways to engineer sidewalks that would be more cost-effective if a resident have to adapt some of the costs or absorb some of the costs with the city?
Yes. So,
And I'm sorry, and what's
go
the
ahead.
time frame after you make all these meetings? What's the time frame that this will roll out?
It's our goal, September, early fall, to
Okay.
put together a policy, a comprehensive sidewalk repair program moving forward based on, in response to the settlement, the Willits case settlement. And you residents, stakeholders, neighborhood councils will have an opportunity to weigh in on the proposed policy. And then the joint committee would take it to full city council for adoption. And again, our ultimate goal is early fall of this year.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, our next speaker, James Baeza.
Good afternoon, Chair, Committee. Thank you for having this meeting here. I appreciate you bringing downtown to our neighborhood. It's very nice to see. I have two things. As a member of the Coastal San Pedro Neighborhood Council, coming before us has been the question of liability when the homeowner is given the full responsibility for the maintenance of their sidewalk in front of their property, which my understanding is it's still city property, just the homeowner maintains it. Where would that liability fall for any accident, since it is just a pedestrian thoroughfare? And then my second question is a personal one as a property owner, although this doesn't apply to me, but corner lots, in order to make them ADA accessible, would require a larger expense to that homeowner if that burden was to be placed on them. I was wondering whether there'd be any assistance from the city for that, since that's a special circumstance of a corner lot. And thank you very much.
Do you mean because of ramps?
Yes,
Because of ramps
because
at
of
the corner?
ramps, yeah.
The city has a current ongoing curb ramp program, and the city would be responsible for the curb ramp component of the sidewalk repair, not necessarily the rest of the sidewalk, just depending. And generally, whenever we come in to resurface a street, I'm sorry? Yeah, it requires us to put the curb ramp in if it does not exist, or fix it if it's not compliant with the current ADA laws, because the ADA specifications periodically change on us, and we don't have to change it when the law changes, but we have to change it when we touch it.
Okay.
Kind of building code, like when you fix it, you have to upgrade to the current building
Sure,
code.
right.
It's the same for us when we're dealing with street repairs and curb ramps.
And then
And the liability question, in the state of California, this has been the ongoing debate in most of the cities in the state of California. It's the property
owner
owner's
has the
responsibility
liability.
and the
And the
liability.
liability would
liability.
definitely fall straight on the property owner,
Uh,
even though it's a function of the city to allow pedestrians to walk down the side of a street. It's still the property owner's responsibility to assist those pedestrians.
Well, let me just make sure we're clear on this, because the discussion we're having, maybe we're talking about two different things. The discussion that we're having about the change because of the tree root exemption is liability for the cost of repair. If you're talking about personal injury from trip and fall, that is the responsibility of the property owner today. There's
Regardless,
no change in
there's
that.
no change.
It's the homeowner can be liable for a trip and fall for failing to fix that sidewalk today. Now, as it happens, the person who trips and falls generally sues the city because the city has deeper pockets. And as a result of that, we pay out $3 or $4 million a year in trip and fall cases because of broken sidewalks, broken curbs, and so forth. But as a pure matter of law, it is the property owner's responsibility, and the property owner is potentially liable for personal injury, regardless of who is ultimately responsible for the cost of repair of the sidewalk, because it's a right-of-way that the public has over privately owned property.
Okay.
So it's
Okay, great. Thank you
that's
for the
not gonna change.
clarification, because that question's been coming up really frequently within this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jim. Dan Dixon, welcome.
And welcome to all of you to our community. Dan Dixon, Northwest San Pedro Neighborhood Council. I'm pleased by much of what's been said tonight. First, that it's not cast in concrete, so to speak. It is still a moving target. That is good to know. Because there are a lot of specific questions about coordinating city and property owner energies in the most efficient manner possible. And frankly, it's not all about money. It is about interfacing with city employees and city rules. And I urge you to give top priority to smoothing the waters as this moves forward. I'll forego all my specific questions except to say street trees are a difficult, thorny issue for everybody. We know we want trees. We know we want them to shade our streets. They're beautiful, they're what we need, but it's extremely difficult at this point to have trees removed and replanted effectively. And part of the cost of this will be not just the repair of the sidewalk, of course, but what happens to the tree which caused the damage. And I hope that that is spelled out thoroughly and with all the departments in the city that come to bear on this. Thank you.
Thanks, Jan. Can you just shed some light on the tree replacement program? I believe it's going to be consistent on what we are currently have on the replacement policies and practices?
Yes, the expectation is that the city will continue to have and support its existing tree root practices, and the Board of Public Works, I think, actually formalized those practices recently. Mm-hmm. So for general trees, I believe if you're taking it out, the replacement is 2-to-1. For protected species, it's 4-to-1. And we're anticipating that we would continue to support that. We believe that our urban forest is an asset to the city, and so we just are going to have to find a way to continue to maintain the balance. But accessibility would have to be the priority, and if there is a tree that has to be removed in order to have the accessible sidewalk, the city will just have to take the steps necessary to put that elsewhere or replace it with something that's not going to create the same problem. I just can't emphasize enough that accessibility really needs to be a priority without undercutting the importance of our tree canopy either. It's a balance.
Thank you for that. Any other cards?
No, Mr. Chair.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Again, this is one of several joint committee hearings that we're going to continue throughout the city of Los Angeles, and addressing our basic infrastructure for streets and sidewalks is important and a priority for this mayor, as we often hear his back to basics agenda, and for this council. And between Mr. Krikorian and I, I'm happy to serve alongside him to lead this policy discussion on finding ways to fix the basic needs here in the city of Los Angeles, from our sidewalks and streets. Get ready for our streets, because streets, a third of our streets are in failed condition. What's that, 2,800 lane miles, Dennis? 28,000 lane miles. Our streets are in D and F condition, and just blessed to lead that effort as well. And happy to stand with Mr. Krikorian, who is in charge of dishing out the dollars to make sure that we fix our infrastructure as well. So thanks again here to our host and to our community-based organizations that I see here, neighborhood council leaders, our business organizations, our residents. Thank you so much for joining us. Our next hearing will be held next Tuesday. 6 p.m., I believe, 7600 Avalon in South Los Angeles. Oh, here it is right here. South LA, Tuesday, June 30th at the Estelle Van Meter Senior Center. It's not on Avalon. It's on the, okay, 2 addresses. So the one on the flyer is 606 East 76 in Avalon, right? So for those listening, we'll, this is a great flyer Mr. Krikorian's office have put out. It's amazing. Thanks so much for getting the word out. And then, so we'll and then from that, we also have another one July 28th in West Los Angeles, July 29th in Eagle Rock on the east side of Los Angeles, and the San Fernando Valley on July 30th. So no summer recess for Mr. Krikorian and I, as we talked about earlier today. So thanks again, and thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Thank you all.
Thank you.